Why, hello and welcome to the Georgian Book Club. So we are continuing our little exploration of exactly how we got from the Enlightenment or the Augustan and sentimental writers through to the Romantic writers. And this week we are having a look at James McPherson and, well, we're having a look both this week and next week at James McPherson and the Ossian fraud. So this is going to be interesting. So I am totally wearing the right sort of thing for this. But before we start, remember that if you want to support us, there is our shop where we have books and writing services. There is also our Redbubble shop that has over 100 different designs on it. That's a way to support us. If you want to support us and don't want to spend any money, like, subscribe, comment, and share. Always really useful. So we're starting the Ossian fraud. Now, I found out about Ossian when I read Werther, because over the course of Werther, he reads Homer when he is at the beginning of the novel, and by the end of the novel, he's reading Ossian, and some people have seen this as an interpretation of his mental state, that he goes from rationality to irrationality and reading a fraud. So that's sort of okay, well, what is this? So the Ossian fraud was perpetuated by James McPherson. James McPherson is actually really interesting, and there are lots of little bits about this that I want to talk about, so we're going to range around a little bit. But James McPherson was a Scottish writer. His family were Jacobins. He was 9 at the time of the Jacobin Rebellion. His uncle and his father were sort of out of the picture for a bit because they were wanted Jacobins. Now, you would assume that the offspring of Jacobin rebels might be somewhat rebellious. Not quite. Young James McPherson went to university. He returned to the Highlands as a teacher, but much of his career was not spent in as a teacher or a tutor. He very quickly became a government agent for the Hanoverian government. And at one point he was the sitting member of a rotten borough, which he never bothered to visit, and he never bothered to sit in Parliament for. That's why it's a rotten borough. So he's a bit of an odd creature, a Highland Scot with Jacobin-leaning family sympathies, but a Hanoverian agent and the recipient of a rotten borough. This is not exactly sort of the image that you would see. Also, he became, by the end of his life, a very rich man, and he was also, as a Highland landowner, a zealous clearer of the Highlands, which is really, really interesting because I'll go into this about why that is significant. But criticism was made by a contemporary of his that he was a most zealous engager in the Highland clearances, which sounds really odd for somebody who has supposedly collected genuine Highland poetry. He is a very contradictory seeming character. So, what did he do? What is the book we're having a look at? We are having a look at this, which, much like the Chatterton, there really isn't a lot of good editions of this. This one is put out by Edinburgh University Press. It's the only good scholarly edition of the Ossian poems. Most of what you will get are old reprints. If you can get it at all, there are some really dodgy looking ones out there, and there is I think there's a Project Gutenberg version, but this stuff you got to read off a page. Trying to read this stuff off the screen is just torture. Sort of like trying to read Chatterton off a screen. It's torture. So the University of Edinburgh Press has put out a authoritative, scholarly, researchable, like look at proper endnotes and all sorts of pieces of writing in here. All the Ossian pieces are collected in here. So that's what we're having a look at. So what are the Ossian poems? The Ossian poems they started out as fragments. Now, the fragments are more plausible as Highland ballads than the big narrative poems. So he publishes these Highland, or these fragments, these Ossian fragments, in journals in Scotland, and that they get to be noticed. And at this point, you have a degree of people interested in collecting the authentic history of their country. There has been attempts by others earlier than McPherson to start collecting the Highland ballads. Now, these poems are met with such enthusiasm that McPherson is financed to spend 6 months traipsing around the Highlands to find more poems. And what he produces are the Ossian poems. Now, the name Ossian is a problem to begin with. It is a Anglicization. So these are supposed to be translations from Highland Gaelic. Ossian is a problem because this person is already known by a different name, Ossian. Ossian, which is Irish, isn't it? Yeah. That's going to become important. These poems are collected and published as the true culture of the Highland Scots. Now, McPherson knows what he's done. He knows what he's done, but it takes a bit of time, but not that much time, to unravel what he has done. Because what he has done is not count on the fact that across the sea are a whole lot of other people who have shared poems. And they are not terribly impressed with him. Because there is a big difference between the Scottish Highland culture, which is an oral tradition. It has no real written tradition of these ballads, and Ireland, which has a literary tradition. And they've written them down. They've written them down. Now, Highland Scotland did preserve some poems and some stories because of its oral tradition in versions or stories that had been lost in Ireland. But the Irish have a lot of these stories and a lot of these heroes. James McPherson's Ossian is, rather interestingly, old and blind. Oh, I wonder who else is the old blind poet. And no, I'm not talking about Milton. Yes, the old blind oral bard? Yes, Homer. There's a lot of that happens. A lot of that happens. So here we have Highland bardic poems being crunched through James McPherson's idea of what is aesthetically good and what is fitting, an idea of what they should be, and also wrenching them as far as he possibly can from an Irish tradition which is literary. There is more going on here than just a fraud. There's more going on than just wanting to pull the wool over the eyes of smug Southerners, smug Lowlanders and smug Southern English people. There's a lot more happening here, and it is interesting when you start sort of looking at this. Now, Highland Scots are culturally distinct. These are the Pictish people and the Caledonian people, historically. They are the people that the Romans went, oh shit, we're building a wall to keep you lot out. And that was the Lowland Scots. So the Highland Scots, forget it. Weird, scary people. Even the Lowland Scots see Highland Scots as lawless and barbaric for most of Scottish, post-Roman Scottish history. So Dark Ages, medieval history, early modern history. They're like, that lot, they spend all their time fighting and drinking, and they're weird clan people, and we're not... Okay, so they don't start coming under sort of southern control until James VI. So they are spending a lot of history quite isolated culturally from the rest of Scotland, but they're not completely culturally isolated. Who are they talking to? The Irish. They and the Irish are travelling backwards and forwards. They're not far from each other. Northern Ireland and the Highlands of Scotland, they travel backwards and forwards. They have a bardic tradition that travels backwards and forwards. Scottish bards go to Ireland and backwards and forwards. Okay, so these are a distinct culture of their own, and they are not a literary culture, they are an oral culture. And this is something that Dr. Johnson really recognises when he talks about the fact that the form of Protestantism which has been imposed on the Highlands of Scotland is entirely inappropriate. That Presbyterianism is wildly inappropriate for a people who have an oral tradition and who need the rituals of a religion more like Catholicism or like the ancient Pictic Caledonian religion to actually operate effectively. That this Protestantism is entirely wrong for these people. Johnson could recognise that, but then again, Johnson is, going up there to try and see the real Scotland, only to discover that the real Scotland has been rather smashed to bits. And part of that is that imposition of a entirely inappropriate religion on these people. So they are a people with their own culture. So what are these poems doing? These poems are taking the bare bones, the summaries of, a few names, and overlaying that over the top of the actual Scottish culture of the Highlands. Why would you do that? Why would you do that? Now, they're a fraud. They are absolutely categorically a fraud. James McPherson wrote them. He did not collect these stories. He wrote them down. He invented them. He took things from the Highland tradition, but the composition is his. They are decontextualized. They are, they have lost a lot of their cultural meaning because they lose their religion. He has taken them and in his introductions talks of these poems as being from a pre-Christian period, and also that these people were fiercely opposed to the Druidism. Why? Because he has no idea how to do the Druidic religion of the Picts. He has absolutely no idea what the religious elements of these stories would have been for the period that he's pretending they come from. So he makes a point of saying there are no gods that come down like in Homer. Of course, one should ask, why would one assume that ancient Scottish stories would resemble ancient Greek stories? Until you realise he is trying, like Walpole, who was taken in by these, and as part of the reason why Walpole was not interested in Chatterton, because he'd already been suckered in by these poems. Among many, many, many people. These things were very popular. They got translated into multiple languages. They remained popular right through the 19th century. Much like Chatterton. They've fallen out now because this is the only copy I could get, and it was, I think this was about $80. It's not cheap. Like, you really want to be you want to definitely want it because it costs some coin. But these were translated into other languages. This period is the period where people start to create a nationalistic idea of themselves, the countries, the divisions of religion, the later on you'll see in the 19th century you'll see a push to unification for German states or Italy, the Italian city-states, and that isn't possible without creating an idea of a unified culture. A single unified culture, as opposed to, well, I'm from Florence and that's nothing like Napoli and that's nothing like Sicily. How could we possibly be the same country? You create a unifying cultural idea. The German states are doing the same thing. This is what the Brothers Grimm are doing by going out and seeking out the folk tales that we now call fairy tales. You don't see a similar thing in somewhere like France. Why? Because the French are the French. They don't need to do this. The Spanish are the Spanish. They don't need to do this. The Irish aren't doing this. They already have their tradition. What this does is actually drive them to make sure it gets preserved, because they have just witnessed James McPherson butcher the culture of the Highlands. And so they scramble to make sure that their culture is actually preserved, because their culture is particularly under siege, being a colonised country. Now, Scotland is different. Scotland is quite different. The Highlands are already, basically by this time, the Highlands are, their unique culture has been shattered. Has been shattered. There are three big things that have shattered their own culture. It's been shattered by Lowland Scots influence, especially that religious influence, into the Highlands, and the shift in the economy of the Highlands. It has been shattered by the very deliberate English repression of the Highlands, because they formed the basis of the Jacobite power base. So you have a very deliberate English suppression of the Highlands of Scotland, which included the banning of the tartan, the suppression of culture up there. And then you have internally attacks on the Highland culture as the lairds begin to see themselves less as clan chieftains and more as landlords. As landlords, no longer looking after their clan, that is their power base where they draw their military power from to fight each other. Now all these people are a liability, and you can make a lot more money on sheep. So you clear the Highlands, you send them to Canada, you send them to Australia, less so Australia, but you definitely send them to Canada, you send them to the US, you send them away, you get rid of them. And then you stock your land with sheep, because sheep eat grass, and people, they eat more than grass, and it's more expensive to have people than sheep. And so these things will break that Highland culture completely. So it is not a single breaking of Highland culture. Now, one of the things that James McPherson talks about in one of his pieces in this, talking about the poems, is he is at great pains to distance himself from the Irish. He is at great pains to distance these stories from the Irish and to accuse the Irish of stealing these stories. Now, the Irish have basically said this is cultural appropriation. Yes, they have said you're appropriating our culture for goodness knows what ends, and this forces them to revive it and really save it. But James McPherson makes this idea that no, this is Scottish culture, and the things that are different in Ireland are weird, spooky Irish weirdness. That's why they've got fairies and giants and all sorts of weird stuff. But the Scottish stuff is very rational, because we are rational. There's no religion in this, which is interesting. He's trying to make the case that these are older than the Irish, which do have a interplay between Ossian, the hero, and St. Patrick, and the tension between them of the old ways and the new Christianity. The Irish bardic tradition continues into the early modern period. By about the 17th century, it has pretty much run its course. But it is a long tradition, and it is a dynamic tradition, and it moves with the people. So it's culturally significant. The Scottish tradition, however, being an oral tradition, is less dynamic, and that is why some of the stories had actually been preserved that had been lost in Ireland, because the Irish tradition was continually changing and updating and doing things with these stories, whereas the Scottish tradition was a lot more stuck because of its oral nature, and therefore it didn't involve the same sort of innovation that the Irish tradition had. But these are basically what they are doing. You're distancing yourself from the Irish, and the Irish are defending their own culture once this comes out. They're saying, you bastard, you nicked it. How dare you? But this is also part of the neutering of a culture. It's part of the neutering of a culture. It's the same as tartan going from a symbol of rebellion and being a very defiant thing to being conservative and establishment. By ripping the stories out of their context, by rewriting the stories to suit your own ends, by severing a link between the Highland Scots and the Irish, you are neutering them. You are rendering them sentimental images of a lost world. And a lost world is safely dead. A lost world cannot challenge you. And when your own people are clearing the people who have the culture out of the Highlands, all of a sudden Scottish culture gets to be part of the establishment, but it also ends up hollow. This is how you turn a dynamic culture into shortbread boxes and longhorn cattle. So I talk about this with Walter Scott. This is how you destroy a culture. The English did it in Scotland, and then they did it in the rest of the world. Destroying the stories is a way to do that. That's why that is a way to say why these are a problem. The fraudulent nature of them, the debating of that is interesting, and we will go into the 18th century debates of those. But ultimately, this is part of the blueprint of how you destroy a culture, how you destroy an indigenous culture of an area. You destroy it by hollowing it out. And that got spread out to indigenous cultures as the colonial project really ramped up. Because Scotland, as Alistair Gray talks about, and this is really, this is what the film of Poor Things got entirely wrong. Poor Things is about Scotland's complicity in the colonial project. This is part of the colonial project from within. Scotland is not an innocent bystander in Britain's colonial project. Scotland is an active participant, and part of its active participation in the colonial project is the destruction of the Highland cultures of their own country. They contributed to the Lowland Scots, and the Highland Scots themselves contributed to the destruction of that culture. And the idea that, well, now that it's destroyed, we can bring it back. Bring back these pretty stories that we have to restore because the whole thing is dead and dying. And why is it dead and dying? Which is part of the reason why I think the Irish were so narky about this. Because for them, this is not part of a dead and dying culture. This is part of a living culture. And they have absolutely no desire to see their culture be completely crushed to death. But it's also why a Scot would want to separate himself from the Irish, because the Irish are seen by the English as troublesome. They are troublesome, they are difficult, and they keep demanding their independence. They keep doing this. They get it, but they are seen as problematic, and by framing these stories as not at all Irish and the Irish stole them from us and are inferior to us, you're reassuring your English overlords that you are going to be good little complicit colonialists. And it's perfectly safe to send them to Canada because they're not going to have an uprising and they're certainly not going to be problematic, and we'd like to get them out of the Highlands so that we can put our sheep there. And then we can create a tourist industry of all these open spaces and romantic vistas, and no one there to tell you what they had for breakfast. So they are worth having a look at. they are very hard to get a hold of, is the thing that I would definitely say. Now, James McPherson, his ways of getting out of proving that no, they're real. One of his ways, he was in the Americas. He was part of the early settlement of Florida as a government agent. And apparently he lost the originals of some of these poems in a Florida swamp, which is remarkably convenient. Remarkably convenient. So there was a lot that went on with him that was like just dodgy as. But they are certainly worth having a look at. I think that they would be really interesting to look at with, rather than just as poems on their own, because as I said, they're a bit hard to read in that they're so decontextualized. But if you can get a hold of the Irish stories as well, then they might be really interesting to look at, is how have these been mangled? How has he mangled these? That would be a far more interesting project than just looking at these on their own. These are an attempt to create, like all medievalism, a grand history of Northern Europe that doesn't rely on Greece and Rome. That that you can use that in that way, but it's also very deliberately creating a version of Scottish identity that is not going to clash with the emerging the identity that is most useful for being part of the colonial project. He really bends over backwards to explain where the Picts and the Caledonians come from, suggesting that they're a Germanic people rather than a Celtic people. So there is absolutely an agenda that McPherson has to distance Scotland, especially the Highlands, from the Irish. To distance them from, no, we're yes, there was a rebellion, but we're not those rebellious people. We're a Germanic people, not like these ones, not these people over here. So it's a really, he has some really curious things in this book. I think it's not a neutral document, and it's not proper anthropology. It's not proper story collecting. It has an absolute political agenda. Whether this is an absolute political agenda that James McPherson consciously understood, or whether this is part of being a Hanoverian lackey when you have come from a period of when your childhood was spent with the Jacobite rebellion and the aftermath of that, is difficult to understand what prompted this. But there is definitely an agenda in this. So next week, which is finally the last of these, we're actually going to have a look at what Dr. Johnson said about these poems and why he found the fraud offensive. What he found offensive about the fraud. That is our first James McPherson. I will be back next week with the controversy. And until then, farewell. If you would like to support this channel, come across to the Black Cockie Press website, www.blackcockiepress.com.au, where you will find books and other writing services to help with your writing.